So, is it worth putting your pants on? That's the standard these days, because I've noticed that dress codes have slipped steadily. My colleagues are wearing a lot more shorts than they'd ever in previous years, because it's hard to get dressed up for a screen. Hi, everyone. And as you can see, I did actually put pants on for this, because tacos are worth putting pants on for. All right. But really what I'm getting down to is, how excited should we be about the apocalypse? How much should this rile us up? How much should this worry us? How much should this occupy our thought? Because generally speaking, this is an overgeneralization, there's two main kinds of Christians. Those who rarely ever think about the end of the world, and those who can't stop thinking about it. And so the question is, what is the appropriate, healthy response in Christian theology for how to approach the apocalypse? Well, before we can get to any of that, we need to talk about the nature of the apocalypse itself. Thank you, man. So I'm going to talk this very generally. We can get deep down to the specifics of interpreting individual verses when we want to, but that's the fun stuff. But we'll take a general approach here. What is the apocalypse about? What is this Christian theology of the end times all about? Now, the majority of our apocalyptic documents, at least the ones that are in the Bible, like Daniel, Zechariah, Ezekiel, Revelation, these are historical apocalypses. By that I mean that they are revelation about the nature of history, that they're trying to peel back the veil and show what is behind history, what are the mechanics of it, and also what's the shape of it. Because when we talk about history, we always make stories of it. I mean, history is just what happened, but historiography, the writing of history, is the narratives we create of that history. That historiography is all about exclusion, right? Because you can't put down everything that ever happened. That'd be insane. And so by excluding things, we narrow down to those parts we think make a story, those things that we think will give the significance, the meaning of history. And because this is narrative, because this is plot, I think we can use some literary things here. I'm going to get outside my lane a little bit, but hopefully you don't mind me butchering literary studies. One of my inspirations in literary studies is Kurt Vonnegut. Any other fans of Vonnegut out there? All right. Vonnegut firmly believed that the shape of stories was important, and he makes graphs of these. I'm going to make a graph, because now this is academic. We have a graph. All right. So this axis is the story from beginning to end. And this axis is the good or ill fortune of our protagonist. All right. So what do different stories look like? Well, I'll show you a couple of very basic ones. A guy gets into trouble, and he gets out of it. A lot of stories fall into that pattern. All right. Another one. A guy one day finds something really wonderful, like the girl of his dreams. But then he loses her. But then he gets her back. And this has driven romantic comedies for decades. But it's not just romantic comedies, that this story of gain and loss is part of so many stories of our culture. And not just our culture, actually cross-culturally. And so another example here, using the same basic pattern, but starting a little lower, Cinderella, right? Cinderella starts out very low. Then she gets to go to the ball. And the ball, everything's wonderful. But then, comes crashing down in the stroke of midnight. But finally, the prince finds her, puts a shoe on her, and happy as she could possibly be. Notice how different this story, though, is by where the end point is. If you end the story here, then this is your classic boy meets girl or your girl meets boy story. If you ended it here, though, when she loses everything, well, now this is a tragedy. This is the Icarus story, that you gained all this and then lost it all again. If you ended it here, it's just pure wish fulfillment. It's just rags to riches with nothing else in between. So the end point of the story, I'm going to argue here, is necessary in order to see the whole story. This is what we call retrospective patterning. Retrospective patterning is the idea that as we go through literature, we constantly are looking back at what's come before and trying to discern the pattern of it. And we only actually can know the actual pattern of it when we get to the end. To illustrate this another way, Herodotus tells a story about King Croesus. King Croesus was the richest king of all, and he invites the philosopher Solon to his kingdom and shows off his wealth. And he asks Solon, who's the happiest man on earth? And he names some dead guy. And Croesus is like, well, no, who's the second happiest? Another dead guy. He's naming dead guys. I'm like, what's with all the dead guys? And Solon says, you don't know if a man has a happy or sad life until you know the manner of his death. You have to know the end of the story to be able to put together the complete pattern. And later, as Croesus loses his kingdom and his wealth and is being tortured and dying, he says, Solon was right. I was not the happiest man on earth. And so this is why apocalypses are so focused on the end. They're not focused on the end for the end's sake. They're focused on the end so we see the whole shape, that we're seeing the entire shape of history and how this shape of history unfolds. And so this gets me to another really basic principle of interpreting apocalypses. They're not about the end, they're about the present. It's kind of like science fiction, right? Good science fiction is not about the future. Good science fiction is about our own society and using this speculative future to help us examine it. This is why, like, Star Trek is really about the civil rights movement, like 80% of the time. Just by doing it with aliens, we don't offend people as much. And so, in the same way here, good apocalyptic is not about the future, it's about the present. But using the end point of history to find out where things are going. You know, we throw this phrase around a lot, being on the right side of history. You know, you want to be on the right side of history when there's some big social change. Well, that's a curious phrase because it depends on where you're looking at from, right? So let's take something that's less controversial, like Constantine Christianizing the Roman Empire. And what was the right side of history? Well, if you're looking at it in Constantine's day, it might be very controversial. Some see this as very wonderful that he is favoring the Christians. Others saying that he's defunding the pagan temples and, you know, he's breaking with tradition. So very controversial in his own day. You look at it from the Middle Ages, you're like, wow, Constantine's a hero. This is triumph. He has overcome paganism and made the world Christian. We look at it from our own day, this post-Constantinian world, and we say, well, actually, maybe he really messed us up terribly. That he has like deeply embroiled church and state in ways that they really were never meant to get together. And maybe he didn't Christianize the world, but instead he actually opened up Christians to become the persecutors. Because we see, after Christians stop being persecuted, they start persecuting the pagans, then the Jews, then others. And so whether Constantine was on the right or wrong side of history depends on where history ends. Because ultimately that's the final vote on it. When does history end? That's how we can know our values of what was on the right side of history, what was on the wrong side of history. And so apocalyptic, by focusing on the end, is actually showing us what we should value in the here and now, what we should consider to be useful, what we should consider to be good and true. And apart from the end, we can't actually say that except in a relative way. So let's zoom in now from the entire span of history to our little chunk of it. So whatever chunk that is, whether we're talking about our lifetime or this century or something like that, if we know the end point, can we say something about where our chunk of history falls into that? Well, let's graph some more, because graphs are fun. Oh, no. I can do this. I'll write over it. All right. So in our chunk of history, there are basically three possibilities, right, of how this could go. Possibility number one, we could have a downward trend. Possibility number two, we could have an upward trend. And possibility number three, we could have a steady state. So let's explore this. So the downward trend, that we have this original golden age, and now we have fallen from that. This is the myth of conservatism, the myth that there was once a time when things were better than they are now. Now, that time can vary. Maybe it was the 1950s. Maybe it was the Founding Fathers. Maybe it was the Reformation. Maybe it was the early church. Maybe it was the reign of King David. Pick a time that was the golden age, and we have fallen from that. mean, this is at least as old as Hesiod, who described the golden age followed by the silver, then the bronze, and the iron, as we slowly descend from the heights of early times to the low lights of the present. And so if this is the truth, then we are fighting a losing battle. And so either we have to fight this nobly in the face of certain doom, or we are trying to put the brakes on and reverse the trend. And so this is the story of Norse mythology. It ends in Ragnarok, where even the gods themselves are destroyed, the Götterdämmerung. Or this is the story of Lord of the Rings, right? Finally, all the elves go beyond the mortal lands to the far west, and they bring with them things that will never be gotten again, that there are magic in the world that will never return. So this is a very pessimistic worldview. The question is it the correct worldview? Well, there's definitely truth here, and we'll get to that in a second, but I think that this is not the position of biblical apocalyptic. Just one thing I'd throw at you here is Isaiah 43. Isaiah 43 talks about, look not at the former things, remember not the things past. Behold, I'm doing a new thing. There, Isaiah is speaking to an Israelite people who are nostalgic for the glorious past, when David was on the throne and all things were right. And saying, don't think about those things, don't look back. Look forward, because God's not done doing things, that we're not descending from a golden age, but we're still looking forward to something yet to come. So I would say the conservative myth is flawed. What about the other one, the upward trend, the liberal myth, the progressive myth, that humanity is getting better, that maybe not like consistently, but we're progressing. Maybe this is like Hegelian dialectic, that we move forward and then back, then forward and back, and eventually we get to a point where our mores in the 21st century are better than the mores of the ancient people. Right? We're less sexist, less racist, less everythingist. And so the idea here is we have an upward trend line. And I think that, I don't know what that is. Sorry. So we have an upward trend line, and the problem here again is utopia is a problem. Because, right, the golden age is the problem of conservatism, the utopia is the problem of progressivism. The problem with utopia is that it is a perfect society created by man. And that is not the biblical view. The biblical view says that paradise is only created by God. That, Jesus is very clear, my kingdom is not a kingdom of this world. He also, Daniel says about him that he is the stone not cut with human hands. In other words, this is not a man-made kingdom, but this is a stone not cut with human hands that is going to become a great mountain and fill the earth. In other words, the perfect society we hope for is accomplished by Jesus Christ, according to biblical apocalyptic, by the Son of Man, if you want to use the Old Testament terminology, and not by human improvement and self-improvement. And so I would say that both looking back to a golden age and looking forward to a man-made utopia is Antichrist. So Antichrist is a huge thing in apocalyptic literature. You have the man of lawlessness, the Antichrist, the arrogant horn, the various evil figures portrayed throughout this literature. And the Antichrist is not against Christ. He is in place of Christ. That's the Greek derivation there. That the Antichrist takes on the prerogatives that are Christ's alone and gets people to worship him. And so believing that we can create a society that will bring about the perfect kingdom is blasphemous, idolatrous even. However, the opposite is also true. Thinking that we had that and we can get it back, that is also idolatrous and blasphemous. And so is the solution then that we just don't do anything at all? No, because we live in imitation of Christ. That is a major principle of apocalyptic literature, that you don't just throw up your hands in some nihilistic way, but you continue to fight for what is good and right, not because you can make the world good and right, but because that is what Christ does. And by fighting for what is good and right, you are proclaiming his coming. All right. Third possibility, the steady state. This could be some sort of endless cycle, Battlestar Galactica, all this has happened before and all of it will happen again. Endless reincarnation. But this is also be nihilistic, that there is no meaning to history. The history doesn't have ups and downs, it just has stuff. And we just create these narratives to comfort ourselves against the great blackness of the void. You can do this in a more humanistic way, though. A more humanistic way would be Vonnegut again. Vonnegut argues that, there are ups and downs, we can't actually discern them. In other words, we don't have the wisdom and the foresight and the insight to see whether any given thing is a tragedy or a triumph. We might be totally wrong in our assessments. And I agree with him in some sense. I agree with him that there's a need for humility, a need to not assume that we understand God's plans. But where I disagree with him is what we get in apocalyptic literature. Because apocalypse means revelation, a revealing, something that is shown to you that you could not have learned or could not have known intuitively. And so apocalyptic literature says that God has pulled back the curtain, revealed the true nature of history, and therefore we can make these judgments, and we can know where we are in the scope of history. So where are we? Well, this is where it gets paradoxical. Christian theology loves paradox. And so we are simultaneously in the upslope and the downslope, but from different perspectives. So Revelation is a tricky book. Revelation, people like to read it like as one sequential thing from beginning to end. But if you do that, the world ends 3.5 times in Revelation, which seems a little off. And so I don't read Revelation sequentially, but cyclically. That it's looking at the same events from different points of view. And so Revelation talks about the Great Tribulation, that things are getting worse and worse until we get to the Great Tribulation, where even the elect would fall away if they were not upheld by Christ. But the Revelation also talks about the millennium, the 1,000-year-long reign of Christ on earth. And the question is, which one comes first, the tribulation or the millennium? And the answer is, they're simultaneous. That right now, we are living in the Great Tribulation. Right now, the world is getting more and more broken. Entropy is setting in until we get to the heat death of the universe. Don't worry, we'll destroy ourselves long before that. But simultaneously, we are living in the kingdom of Christ, that we are reigning with Christ in the heavenly places, as Paul says in Ephesians 2. And so these are both true. Our experience tells us that things are going to hell in a handbasket, and our experience is accurate. But our faith tells us that this is the work of Christ, and that we are already in his kingdom, and our salvation has already happened. That these are simultaneous realities, that we live in this paradoxical world. So I said it's all about the present. So if we know that things are going badly and things are going great, depending on if you're looking from experience or faith, how then shall we live? Under the cross of Christ. Because in the cross of Christ, we see the depth of human suffering and injustice. We also see Christ reigning from the cross and drawing all men to himself. That these exist simultaneously on the cross. And so we don't need to discern the ups and downs of our life and where that fits into how we should live. Instead, we look to Christ and see how in our shame is glory and in death is life. All right. So one last thing here, and that is, when does the world end? Well, I'm not going to tell you like a date because that'd be crazy. There's things like the Great Disappointment when a bunch of people like sold their... Yeah. You know, the Great Disappointment, a bunch of people like figured out the date, they sold all their possessions, and then he didn't show up. It was really embarrassing. The prophets talk about this in a strange way. So if you read Zechariah, for instance, Zechariah 9 through 14, you read this like, this is totally about the end of the world. You know, there's apocalyptic events. You know, we have, the moon being darkened. We have, the Mount of Olives being split asunder and all kinds of crazy, wars and stuff. But the New Testament interprets this as these being events in the life of Christ. That actually the New Testament quotes this section more than any other prophet in the Passion narratives. And so is Zechariah 9 through 14 about Jesus coming and dying on the cross, or is it about the end of the world? Yes. We call this prophetic perspective. So I'm from Illinois. I had not seen very many mountains in my life growing up. You can see lots of corn, 50 miles of corn, but no mountains. And so this is a new thing into look over and see these mountains. But as you look at that, you see different ranges, and there's different layers. And if you were standing between the mountains, you could distinguish, okay, those are those, those are those. But from here, they're just one tableau, just one picture that is all superimposed upon each other. This is how the prophets speak, that they don't see the first coming of Christ and the second coming of Christ as distinct events, but as a single tableau. And this is not just simply that they were far away from all these events. They're seeing that this is all the same pattern at work. That if we want to understand the cross, we need to look to the end of the world. If we want to understand the end of the world, we need to look to the cross. And so this is, in a sense, the world is already end, and we just haven't realized it yet. The anime Neon Genesis Evangelion proposes, what if the world is already end and we just haven't figured it out yet? But this is actually in the opposite direction. Not that the destruction is already, our doom is already sealed, but rather our salvation is already sealed and we just haven't realized it yet. Or we only can realize it through faith and not through observation. And so, should we get our pants on for the apocalypse? Is this something that we should get all in a twist about? There's a good German word for this. That German word is Jein. Jein is a portmanteau of ja and nein. So yes and no, Jein. In a sense, we don't need to get all worried about this because whether it comes today or it comes in 1,000 years, it doesn't really make a difference because Christ brings about the apocalypse and Christ brings about the new kingdom, and this is not any part of our work or doing. But in another sense, it does matter, and it does require us to think very carefully about it, because this affects how we live. What do we consider to be the right side of history? Well, it's what is on the right side of history when the final judgment comes. Notice it's always judgment at the end. But it's not just judgment to threaten us, but judgment to judge what was what. And the thing about the apocalypse affects what we see as valuable. What things will last beyond an apocalypse? And in the end, there's only so many things that will last beyond an apocalypse. Ecclesiastes says that whatever God does endures forever. And so in the end, the work of God through us and in us is going to be the things that actually last. And so apocalypse is all about reorienting our compass to what actually matters. It's not about the seven-headed dragons and the lakes of fire and such. And if we want to get into that, I can talk about what those are actually about. And so I'll wrap up here and say, yes, do put your pants on for the apocalypse, but if you put on shorts or a skirt, that's okay too. All right, let's open up some questions.
What do you recommend that we say, or what is there really to say to someone we know that is maybe overly concerned about the apocalypse, considering the fact that we really can't do anything about it? So what would be some recommendations of yours for how to talk to them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good question. So the first thing is I should say a lot of people who are really obsessed with the apocalypse, they're this way because they were bludgeoned with it. In at least certain circles, mostly evangelical circles, the apocalypse is used either as a club to beat people into submission, that you terrify them enough they're going to be a good Christian, or it's like a lurid thing, like this is like this exciting thing of death and destruction that we can enjoy, kind of like watching disaster movies. And so I guess one thing is you need to figure out which one of those perspectives they're coming from. If they're just joining this as a lurid thing, I guess let them have their entertainment. If they've been bludgeoned with this, I think it's important to show that the rhetorical purpose of apocalyptic is comfort. That this is actually, apocalyptic thrives in the darkest times of history. The times when these are written and these things are read the most would be the Babylonian exile, the Maccabean persecutions, the Roman persecutions of Christianity and the Roman destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. These are the times that apocalyptic thrives. It's literature of oppressed people, and showing that this is to raise up the oppressed and not to beat down people.
All right, I have a couple texts that have come in. If we know that the world is going to continue to get worse, where can we find motivation to work to make this world a better place? And then after that, that's the very definition of insanity, isn't it? Social justice matters don't necessarily last, but they're very real today. How do we find balance? So 3 questions in there, all in one text. Thank you.
All right, yeah. So I'm not sure if I'm going to hit all of them, but I'll do my best. I think a very helpful voice here is Dietrich Bonhoeffer in his Ethics, where he talks about hunger. We cannot end world hunger. It's not something that is going to happen until the kingdom is fulfilled in Christ. But if we fail to feed the hungry, we are blaspheming Christ, is what he says. And the reason why is because we are called to be imitators of Christ and called to be heralds of his kingdom. And so to reject that calling and to say that nothing matters is a false witness. And so we don't believe we can heal every sick person. This is getting extremely relevant in the pandemic, right? At what point do we stop wearing the masks when not a single person left on earth has COVID? And I can almost assure you that at some point you have transmitted a flu to someone else that transmitted to someone else, transmitted to someone else that killed someone. We can't control this, and this is what terrifies us, right? We cannot control these things, but that does not mean we should stop trying. We shouldn't just say, well, since we can't save every single person, let's let God sort them out. That we are called to love our neighbor and to sacrifice on behalf of our neighbor. And so there's this weird balance between realizing we cannot save the world, but realizing that we are still called to be Christ to this world.
Dr. Elliot, the question is, to what extent has Christian eschatology been affected by other religions or societies and their beliefs, or is there no effect?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is a great question. So some people think that if you can find the genealogical roots of a movement or an idea, then you've defined it, you understand it. But the problem here is that apocalyptic literature is more than the sum of its parts. Yes, it can be shown pretty clearly that there are various pagan elements that underlie Jewish and Christian apocalyptic. For example, the beasts in the book of Daniel. There's these 4 beasts that rise out of the ocean and wreak havoc across the earth. Yes, Daniel is a kaiju movie. But these beasts that come out of the sea and wreck the earth, these are Taninim. Taninim are chaos dragons. These come from Babylonian mythology. And so you say, oh, it's just warmed over Babylonian mythology, ho-hum. No, not at all. And here's actually the fascinating thing about the Taninim. So what's the deal with all the chaos monsters, right? We have lots of chaos monsters in Revelation, Daniel, Ezekiel. The deal with them is this is subverting Babylonian mythology. So in Babylonian mythology, we have Marduk, the patron god of Babylon, overcomes Tiamat, the chaos dragon. And so here we have civilization overcoming barbarism. We have chaos being quelled by the empire-building Babylon. In Daniel, the chaos monsters are Babylon and its followers. Babylon, Persia, Greece, etc. These are the chaos monsters. So it's not that civilization will save us from chaos, as the Babylonians, but rather civilization is the chaos from which only the kingdom of Christ can make things right. And so I'd say that, yes, there are totally pagan roots in Christian apocalyptic, but you always have to see how they're using them and what it means in the full context of Christian apocalyptic.
Thank you. A follow-up to that is on Zoom. Dr. David Schultz is joining us, and he was responding to that question in his discussion of the role of rhetoric in terms of the apocalypse. Would you like to speak to that, Dr. Elliot?
So as I said, apocalypse is not about the future, it's about the present. It is about the future, though. It does talk about prophecies of the future. It does tell us what the end point of history is, but the rhetorical purpose of this is always for the present. And so the rhetoric of this is we are not going to accept the status quo as the final word on history, that the Babylonians or the Romans or whoever don't get to say what is truth and what is beauty and all that is good. Instead, God is the ultimate judge of these things, and so the rhetorical function here is to stand up in the midst of oppression, but not in a conquer the Romans sort of way, but rather in a the Romans don't get to define where history is going sort of way.
We do have an additional question which says, please do tell us about the seven-headed dragon and the lakes of fire.
Well, I kind of told you a little bit already when I mentioned Daniel the Kaiju movie, right? And so the beasts are the empires of this world, and these are the forces of chaos that are torturing God's people. But the end of the beasts is almost anticlimactic. It's like in one verse of Daniel, then God takes them all and throws them in the fire. It's like, there's no battle at all. It's just like, and now they're in the fire, and they're burning forever. All right. The point here is that the rise and fall of empires is not just the vagaries of historical forces. The rise and fall of empires is in the hand of God, and the purpose of this is so that he can accomplish his plan, that even the Romans factor into God's plans. So, Daniel uses a symbol language that would have been comprehensible to his original audience. Revelation uses a symbol language that would have been comprehensible to the original audience. And this symbol language is based on all kinds of things that would have been in their popular culture, whether that's pagan mythology or Jewish legends or whatnot. And it's not saying that these are true, these pagan mythology and Jewish legends, but rather these are the spare parts that they use to create their symbol language, that the people then know what things mean. They know what a beast is. It's a chaos dragon. They know this. So I think that covers it more or less.
I have a question for you, Dr. Elliot. How has thinking about this and studying the apocalypse impacted your own perspective on how you live?
So it's very easy to get drawn into the news cycle. You go doom scrolling through your feed and see how the entire world is going to hell, and it's very easy to try to make the things of this world into the kingdom of God. And so I think that the thing I always keep telling myself whenever I do my doom scrolling is this is not the kingdom. That this is not the kingdom, and so in the end, this will pass. The great expression from Jewish legend, "This too shall pass."